ICC might contain colonialism as a crime alongside apartheid, ecocide, use of mercenaries, neocolonialism, many crimes that implicate white Western actors. And then at the last minute, what happened is that Western states came in. They had been invited to give comment every year between 83 and 96, and then did not take up the opportunity.
ICL can be reimagined as not just the culprit, but also the remedy that can address colonial violence or colonial oppression. Yet doctrinally, our field remains tethered to individual criminal responsibility and to events that are always framed in the microcosm as discrete episodes, sometimes of gross inhumanity, other times of very human-like violence.
We have seen in the last few years, in particular around Gaza, the crumbling of the former alliance between liberal democracies and human rights universalism. So what I'm saying is, even that minimum of justice for mass atrocities that was declared in the previous decades as somehow a not renounceable moral common ground of liberal democracies, it's completely crumbled.
Colonial domination is thought of existing through force, but there is no clear articulation of what force is meant over here. The broader understanding of what force generally is understood as within international law, of course, is through the paradigms of armed conflict. But is that only the way to understand force?
How much this colonial past are shaping the failures of the system today, and why we're struggling so much for crimes that are completely obvious, severe, and punishable to punish them.
Maybe we could think hunting as having a double face. So we are hunting the ghosts as a method, but the ghosts are also hunting us. These ghosts are hunting us in many different ways, and the attacks against the ICC and international criminal law more broadly are maybe a form of ghosts, coming back or hunting the people who are still alive in a way.
It's a wonderful initiative.
The Global South Network opened new horizons for judicial cooperations.
Global South Network provide a platform for meaningful dialogue and cooperation, fostering efforts to build a more equitable and resilient legal landscape.
GSN Network continues to expand areas of activity, further strengthening its impact and reach.
The universal concept of justice compels us to join our efforts, and this is the forum for promoting the same goal.
Well deserved for the hectic activity you have made. I am astonished, I am amazed, I was impressed.
May I at the outset commend you, Dr. Ayat, for the immense work that you're doing in the GSN. The Global South Network is a much admired initiative.
It's commendable. South Network focuses on all disciplines and regions, creating a bridge between academia, whole society, legal community, etc.
Quiero expresar mi sincero agradecimiento al Dr. Naumanreayat.
Dr. Naumanreayat, the founder and convener of the Global South Network. His visionary leadership has established a vibrant forum where judges, academics, and practitioners from around the world can share and exchange ideas. Initiatives like today's dialogue allow us to compare jurisprudence, share best practices, and develop common principles. This has the potential to contribute to transnational standards in procedure and enhance administrative law globally.
I would like to point out that Dr. Reayat's initiatives have not only enriched comparative judicial dialogue, have also fostered mutual understanding of the diverse challenges that courts face in safeguarding the rule of law and constitutionalism.
We can rule when we want in the cases which are brought to us by citizens and residents. In the EU, this openness of mind is increased by the fact we apply, in some cases, same norms from the EU treaties or the EU directives or regulations.
So good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 49th seminar in Phase 4 of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the Global South Network. Before we begin today's discussion, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Naumanreayat, lecturer in law at Leicester Law School and founder and chief convener of the Global South Network for his tireless effort in organizing and leading this inspiring weekly series that continue to bring together scholars and practitioners from across disciplines and regions. I am Dimitrios Kurtis and I hold a PhD focused on genocide and the right to exist in international criminal law from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, where I also teach public international law presently, and I am planning to finish my postdoctoral research project. So it's my pleasure today to chair the Global South Network's PhD in Progress session, and I'm really looking forward to learning about the presenter's research and engaging in the discussion that will follow. I'm joined by two discussants and two peer commentators, as it's standard practice in these seminars by the Global South Network. First, my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Luigi Daniele, who is the first discussant for today's session. Dr. Daniele is presently an associate professor in international law at the University of Studies of Molise in Italy. He previously taught and researched international humanitarian law and international criminal law at Nottingham Law School of the Nottingham Trent University. His research focuses on the law of targeting, war crimes law, and the proposed crime of ecocide. His latest contribution concern the misuses of the notion of collateral damage, the crisis and changing landscape of genocide studies, and the war crimes of destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity. He is the author of the book entitled Indiscriminate and Disproportionate Attacks in International Law, Bridging the Accountability Gap, published with Hart Publishing. Also, together, we have Dr. Anamika Misra, who is the second discussant for today's session. Dr. Misra is a lecturer at the City Law School of the City St. George University. She is a multidisciplinary scholar whose work spans across critical legal theory, Black studies, and visual humanities. She specializes in conceptualizing how law interfaces with racializing regimes of domination, focusing on the transatlantic slave trade, Euro-modern colonization, and their afterlives. Also, today with us is Ayesha Umana Dajud, who is the first peer commentator for today's session. She is a doctoral candidate in Science of Law at Cornell University. Ayesha's professional experience spans roles at the Office of the Public Counsel for the Victims of the ICC in the Netherlands, the Special Jurisdiction for the Peace created by the 2016 peace agreement between FARC and the Colombian government, and legal research positions for the Women and Justice Collection of the Legal Information Institute and the Death Penalty Center in the United States of America. Last but not least, we have together with us today Alice Phil, who is the second peer commentator for today's discussion. She is a PhD researcher in international relations and international law at the École Normale Supérieure, in geopolitics of risk in Paris, and at the University of Roma Tre in the law department in Rome, and a doctoral fellow at the Institute of NRS. Her PhD investigates how the datafication of people on the move in West Africa is reshaping legal infrastructures and rights claims as digital border control technologies transform power relations and create new vulnerabilities. Today, Jo, who is the main star obviously, will present part of her PhD project entitled Imperial Kinships, Coercive ERASURES, and Legal Settler Internationalism. And it's as a subtitle, the research has Colonialism as a Crime Against the Peace and Security of Mankind, which is a really, really interesting topic. So before giving the floor to her for her presentation, we should point out that this is a really important topic touching upon the core of what we today consider critical approaches to international criminal law. Obviously, between 1983 and 1996, the International Law Commission resumed its earliest post-Nuremberg mandate to elaborate a draft code of crimes against the peace and humanity of mankind. This was obviously a step towards the establishment of what is today known as the International Criminal Court. However, during this period, the Commission did not limit itself to the Nuremberg Canon of Core Crimes, Article 6 of the Nuremberg Charter, which included crimes against peace, what we now call the crime of aggression, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, but also, let's say, played with anti-colonial legal imagination and sought to recognize colonial domination as a crime of concern to the international community as a whole. This is what Jo will speak for. She will speak up for this very interesting topic approximately for 30 to 35 minutes, followed by comments from our discussants and, time permitting, and you are willing, a question and answer session. So without further ado, Jo, we're delighted to welcome you here today. The screen and the imaginary floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for reading that abstract, so I don't have to. Thank you, everyone. It's such an honor to be here today. I must thank Nauman and the discussants, chairs, for taking the time and spending time in this really wonderful gathering. It's such an honor to be here. Looking through the website of the network, it's quite inspiring. So thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for taking the time. So I'm going to share a slide deck, but before I do, I want to just say a couple of things. And so I want to start with this moment that's actually a couple of days ago, on the 30th of November and the 1st of December, the African Union met in Algiers. And they were discussing, in fact, the criminalization of colonialism. And I just want to read from the declaration. So they say, "We reaffirm that colonialism, transatlantic slavery, deportation, and apartheid constitute crimes against humanity and forms of genocide, which have inflicted systemic harm on African peoples. These acts represent the most serious violations recognized under international law and international humanitarian law and remain imprescriptible. We are committed to advancing the international recognition of colonial crimes and working towards their codification as explicit crimes within international legal instruments and mechanisms." And they go on to talk about African mechanisms, as well as, not that African mechanisms aren't global, but in the vernaculars of international law, it is often spoken about like that. So I've been thinking, and one of the things that I'll come to is I use haunting as method, and the idea of these resonances and colonial continuities, and this period that Demetrios is talking about, this 1983 to 1996, when it looked like the kind of prelude to the ICC might contain colonialism as a crime, alongside apartheid, ecocide, use of mercenaries, neo-colonialism, many crimes that implicate white Western actors. And then at the last minute, what happened is that Western states came in. They had been invited to give comment every year between 83 and 96, and then did not take up the opportunity until the last minute, when it's such a moment in the archive, because it actually feels quite, one of the commissioners describes it as a mutilated draft. It's this moment where they've been working on it for 13 years, and these states just come in and eviscerate it. And so the text that comes out is a reproduction, basically, in many, many ways, of what we know to be the core concepts of international criminal law. So I just wanted to start with that moment of a history of the present, and to think about colonialism and coloniality not as something in the past, or not necessarily as something that is explicit, for example, in Palestine, but as something that is ongoing in the afterlives of formal decolonization of states. So just by way of situating us, I will be doing a brief overview of the efforts to criminalize colonialism, and thank you to Nauman for the structure, because as a sort of political theorist of the law, I don't often do this, and it was so clarifying. So then talking about on location, which I'm thinking about the location in the literature of this question, but also how location is thought about in international criminal law, in jurisdiction, and in the ways in which the narrative emerges. And then I'm going to move on to my method, which I use Haunting as method, drawing on Avery Gordon's work in Ghostly Matters. And then I will present two of the arguments, one of which is a more sort of critical ICL, international criminal law argument, and one is more of an international relations, realpolitik, geopolitik argument. And then in the final move, I guess, I wanted to think a little bit with this group, given its nature, about how we think, how I might think, and how we might think within and against and between disciplines, because that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is how to bring together the kind of socio-legal side and the IR side when they are so similar anyway. Okay, so 1983, there's this moment where the first task of the International Law Commission is criminalizing is to come up with a draft code against of crimes against the peace and security of mankind. And so this is a project from the 40s and 50s. And in fact, some argue the kind of raison d'etre of the establishment of the ILC. And what kind of transpired is often the case. They could not come to consensus about the crime of aggression. The Vietnam War happened. That had to be kind of imagined as external to ICL. The Cold War happened. Any number of things happened. And that was shelved. And then it was resumed because the General Assembly of the United Nations requested it in '82. And then you have this moment where you're seeing some of the most, in the 80s, you're seeing across South Africa, there's a picture over here of Chris Hani and Winnie Madikizela Mandela. And here, and this I'm just sort of trying to contextualize this historical moment. This is the Gulf War below. And so these are the kind of contexts where you're moving from the 80s into the 90s. And this is the space in which this moment is arriving. So what I've done in the PhD is I've kind of theorized through the archive and against it, but thought about it through the lenses of different theoretical spaces, largely connected to anti-colonial humanism and various anti-racist and anti-colonial and anti-capitalist traditions in domestic and international law. And that was, so it really was an exercise in following the footnotes, because this moment in history has been not only written out of the corpus of international law, but also all but erased from the archive. And this is something that I think about a lot in the context of international criminal law, where there is such a kind of fixation on what can be seen, what can be evidenced, what can be proven, what can be archived, that for obvious reasons is very important. But throughout history, we have seen the unarchiving, the misarchiving, the erasure of colonial struggle, anti-colonial struggle, and colonial domination. So I sort of think about this moment in many ways as, when the British burnt the archives in Kenya after the Mau Mau rebellion, before there was potential accountability, and there's this instinct to destroy the evidence that I think we're seeing in Palestine as well, or to fetishize the evidence on the other hand. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of set the context, and then to read briefly how colonial domination was defined. And it's very interesting because it's this site of contestation in the ILC when it's a battle between, and it's a lot of Latin American countries pushing obviously around the use of mercenaries and neocolonialism. You're in in Nicaragua taking a particularly strong role there. Asian countries, African countries, it's kind of this anti-colonial moment, this anti-colonial moment. In resonance, the International Court of Justice in the system, an attempt to do anti-colonial lawyering. So the definition was any individual who as a leader or organizer establishes or maintains by force or orders another individual to establish or maintain by force colonial domination or any other form of alien domination contrary to the rights of peoples to self-determination as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. So in legal terms, it's quite a comprehensive way of thinking. I mean, it's quite a comprehensive way of thinking it within the limits of the law. So that is a brief overview of a moment where, and I kind of want to say this before I continue, is that again, to go back to this idea of presence and absence, one of the things I put forward is that in the same way we take seriously a trial in absentia, we ought to take seriously an aspect of a criminalization in absentia. So the fact, for example, that the Genocide Convention came into force in the same year that apartheid was established in South Africa and in Israel, in Palestine, and considering Kashmir at the same time, and in this moment, and there's countless more examples where you're having this awakening for human rights and human dignity, and at the same time seeing colonialism and subjugation across the world. So it's for me, the way I think about it is it's been present since Nuremberg. It's been present in its absence. So I just want to contextualize this kind of legal framing of and adopt quite a broad notion of how I interpret this and how these forces come together under the force of global capitalism, and how this defines the very human themselves. So I to think about this in the context of the scramble for Africa, in the context of the legacies of colonial legal origins, and I've put there, and I know Luigi is looking at ecocide, so that's Agent Orange in Vietnam, and how kind of environmental fallout has always been part of this, but also written out. And I guess want to make one point, which is not really frequently considered in the ICL literature, at least, is the importance of capital and capitalism, and the ways in which it's really difficult to think clearly about an atrocity lens without understanding the undergirding racial capitalism, given that all capitalism is racial. So yeah, and then so that's there. So on location in the literature, so I've situated this within the Hague conversation, which, as I'm sure many of you will know, is this kind of teleological historicization, mythological narrative, which suggests a linear kind of legal narrative arc between Nuremberg and the Hague. It is in many ways a civilizational discourse, and it has come to be so dominant in international criminal law thinking that I have found, even in critique, it very often the epistemologies of linearity, of a kind of Darwinian evolutionary thought inhere in the civilizational discourses of international criminal law. So where I've situated this is in terms of Nuremberg to the Hague, which I've sort of set up as mythos. And it's a subtle difference, I guess, than what is happening in the historical to critical historical turn in international criminal law, where we're seeing amazing work come out, sort of rethinking the history of ICL, obviously coming on the back of people thinking about the colonial histories of these things for a very long time in other fields. But to see this work, there's a lot of work coming out here. I think of it slightly differently, more as narrative, as origin story, as mythos, but the engaging history. And I have tried to think about this alongside thinking about colonial racial capitalism. And it's interesting in the literature is that very often the kind of Twale scholarship, which is not as much focused on international criminal law, but will sometimes speak about colonialism without speaking about race. There's a lot of scholarship that speaks about capitalism without speaking about race, or race without speaking about colonialism. So what I've done in the thesis is kind of tried to bring together different spaces in different legal architectures where we can think together of these kind of social forces. So yeah, I come to the conclusion in terms of where the literature is that at the onto-epistemic level, the methodological nationalism, colonial aporia, and evidentiary fetishism of hegemonic international criminal law grammars forecloses genuine engagement with the ICCs and the fields undergirding racial capitalist coloniality. This is reciprocally reproduced by the spectral centrality of colonial domination in the Nuremberg to the Hague mythos. So continuing with location, I think often it's interesting with Nuremberg, in fact, not theoretically and empirically, Nuremberg and the Hague are cities on a map. But when we speak about Nuremberg to the Hague, it means something different. The geography is abstracted. It sometimes reflects a temporal journey. And so I think there's a kind of metaphorical approach to mapping, to cartography, that inheres, and that is part of sort of this ability to develop absolute and negative space. So I want to kind of bring this into thinking about where are we located in terms of time. And I think here with Michel Rolph-Trouillon, who wrote a fantastic book in 1995 called Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. And what Trouillon urges is attention to both the mentions and the silences in the archive, and a continuous kind of relationality between the past and the present and the future. So he says, the past does not exist independently from the present. Indeed, the past is only past because there is a present, just as I can point to something over there only because I am here. And through this understanding of this kind of interstices between past, present, and future, Trouillon comes to the point where he says, in the archive, there are these moments where things are decided, where it is decided what will be archived, how it will be archived, how it will be understood, and what will be invisibilized. And he says, history is the fruit of power, but power itself is never so transparent that its analysis becomes superfluous. The ultimate mark of power may be its invisibility, the ultimate challenge, the exposition of its roots. So thinking with this, given what we've just discussed about the invisibilization of colonial domination and its omnipotence and omnipresence since throughout their kind of conventional history of international criminal law, I'm interested in thinking about what kind of power relations inhere in this excision of the crime of colonial domination from the corpus of international criminal law, and how it might produce a structural impunity that has an impact not just on the fact, can we prosecute colonialism or not, but on the very structuring, the architecture, the epistemology, and the ways of being, knowing, and thinking within the ambit of international criminal law. So the kind of challenge that I faced when thinking about how to talk about colonial domination, because one risks, on the one hand, kind of getting into an over-juridification line, where the solution would be just to, if you included it, it would be fine. If you included it and you still had the temporal jurisdiction at the ICC from 2002, then that writes out a whole lot of colonial instances of colonial domination. It also forecloses an understanding of the histories and preambles that lead to contemporary violence and sets up false temporalities that obviate colonial domination. Having said that, I wonder how we do reparative readings without over-inserting the invisibilized back into the archive without consent. And I guess one of the things about haunting as method is that we owe a debt to the dead, and that there's this idea that it's not just the living, but when we're thinking about archives and how to think about this horrendous violence, that there is a debt and indebtedness to the dead and how we think about this. So Avery Gordon writes, haunting was precisely the domain of turmoil and trouble, that moment of however long duration when things are not in their assigned places, when the cracks in rigging are exposed, when the people who are meant to be invisible show up without any sign of leaving, when disturbed feelings cannot be put away, when something else, something different from before, seems like it must be done. And so when I was writing through the archives and starting to do this work around 2020, because sort of getting into this at the beginning of the pandemic, and in this moment where Trump first instituted sanctions against the ICC, it started to feel like the entire architecture was quite haunted, and that that things were not in their right places, that patterns were not following as they had been, that the teleology was in the process of renewing itself. And so just to think with Avery Gordon about two things. One is how we've not, how we connect exclusions and invisibilities. So she writes, to write stories concerning exclusions and invisibilities is to write ghost stories. To write ghost stories implies that ghosts are real. That is to say that they produce material effects. So what that means to me is that the invisibilization of colonial domination matters in and of itself, regardless of a potential prosecution or not. It fundamentally shifts the way we think and know things. And so Gordon says, to study social life, one must confront the ghostly aspects of it. This confrontation requires or produces a fundamental change in the way we know and make knowledge in our mode of production. So I think of in terms of haunting as method, it's not prescriptive. I think of it as suturing and bricolage. I think of it as kind of bringing together fragmented things to try and avoid a linearity and to see where the footnotes lead, but not without direction. And I think that's where the suturing comes in, as a sense of repair. What does it mean to seek justice for colonial domination? What does it mean to repair this harm within and outside of the law? So I have two arguments. Just go back before that. And I have main arguments that I wanted to present today, one that is a more legal argument and one that is a more IR argument. So the first one is about colonial jurisdiction. And here, what I say is that colonial domination is a ghostly silence in the archive of the ICC and is wholly present, as I've argued, in absentia from Nuremberg in the mythos. The excision of colonial domination as a crime from the corpus of ICL in the prelude to Rome Statute negotiations has grave material consequences, not only in terms of prosecutorial indifference to colonialism qua subject matter, but in the way that temporal, territorial, and personal jurisdiction, and thereby our notions of time, space, and subjectivity, are understood, produced, and juridified through international criminal law, and in particular, at the ICC. This absence further sustains ongoing colonial domination and the coloniality of ICL via a disavowed structural colonial impunity in a field that is ostensibly underscored, where it says the cause of all this cause is the cause of all humanity, is the anti-impunity norm. And this further forecloses analyses of colonial exploitation, extractivism, commodity flows, and settlement. And this is something, I'm based in Johannesburg, and it's something I think about a lot. We work a lot around the ICJ case and the energy embargo. And once we see these kind of flows of commodities and how they sustain genocides, it's very difficult to abstract this force of global capitalism from the atrocity archives, as it is wont to do. And at the same time, ICL cannot be abstracted from the structures of global genocidal racial capitalism. This is both informed and it's reproduced by the racializing silence. So what I'm getting at here is that it's not just that it's informed by this, but that it actually produces racial subjectivities and gendered subjectivities and ways of knowing and being human. So my second argument that is tethered to this one is about imperial kinship and settler colonial internationalisms. And one of the things that I think a lot with the closing of borders, global placement is nationalist sentiment that is often analyzed through methodological nationalism or populist or fascist, whatever your chosen framing is, and it's framed as this is happening in the UK, this is happening in the US, and what Zina Magubane talks about is these kind of circuits of colonial knowledge, material ideology, between different spaces. She looks, for example, at the Carnegie Corporation's Poor White study in South Africa and how that informed the racial regime in the United States in many ways and vice versa. So essentially, I think that with the question the bottom line question, as my granny would say, the bottom line question is, why has there never been a prosecution of a settler colonial power at the ICC? And there's many reasons, and that can be, there's many people who've done great scholarship on this. But from a theoretical perspective, and for what the archive seems to tell me is that, it's if you indict settler colonialism in one place, you have shattered and unsettled the entire premise of colonial world order. So one of the things that I found in looking at the geopolitics of this and coming from that moment after the draft was finished in 93 and 96, where there's settler colonial states come in and regardless of differences across many levels will kind of come together very often to ensure that there is impunity effectively for imperial forces. So liberal realpolitik is thus inseparable from connected white settler internationalisms. So these nationalisms connect to each other, and I think this is often left out despite the international character of international criminal law. So empirically, at critical junctures in the history of international criminal law, settler colonial and imperial states have deployed Machiavellian diplomacy to attempt to thwart the gains of anti-colonial lawyering. And so that's what we saw in the 80s, in the 90s. And through Avery Gordon's work, what I'm saying is that this is a ghost story of colonialism invisibilized by the colonial linear teleology that is ICL's epistemic scaffolding. The spectral echoes of this practice morph and mutate, renew and redouble to sustain themselves almost autopoetically in contemporary international law spaces and places. So I think there, what we're seeing. If you look at, for example, Trump's sanctions on ICC personnel at the moment, if you look at the attacks, Dr. Naledi Pandor, the former Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa, current chair of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, was just denied a visa by the United States. She is the minister, I guess, most responsible for taking the ICJ case to court. So I think, these resonances of an attempt to shut down anti-colonial lawyering exist in conversation with the past, present, and future. And I've put here the definition again, and three, I guess, potential perpetrators. And just to think through how these moments are connected. So I think what I'm going to ask you to think through with me is how we ethically kind of deal with an invisibilization, and how, given the nature of this space, how we think what I've spoken about as simultaneous translation across, between, and against disciplines. Because, as Sylvia Wynter says, if we think beyond the discipline, then think of the dazzling creativity of the alternative challenge that would be opened up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo, for this wonderful presentation. We have a lot to process here, because this is actually a very interdisciplinary research between law, history, but also international relations and geopolitics. So without abusing my privilege as the chair of today's discussion, just two very, very brief observations, and then I will pass the floor to our proper commentators, Luigi and Anamika, and then to our peer commentators as well. The first thing that one has to, let's say, point out from the viewpoint of international criminal law, a subject of public international law I hold dear and I have researched for quite a long time, is the term of defining a crime, even a crime that can be traced back to archival research or to, the whole collegial project of writing this draft code, which stems from the very core, from the very spine of the Nuremberg process and the Nuremberg principles. So the ILC debates, at least according to my own understanding and research, are really inconclusive as to what colonial domination was imagined as a system, and how the system, from the macrocosm of geopolitics and collective injustice, was transferred and transplanted to the compartmentalized and individualized process of international criminal law. And so colonialism and colonial oppression might be a mode of governance, a structure of economic extinction, a racialized ordering of the global space, or a composite of all three. So it would be nice to hear your thoughts, or have something in your final output of your research, giving a few, comments or a few observations about the definitional question. And the second thing I need to point out, because this forms also part of my own research and contribution to the international criminal law literature, has to do with the conformant nature of international criminal law. I mean, your project implicitly suggests, according to my own understanding, that ICL can be reimagined as not just the culprit, but also the remedy that can address colonial violence or colonial oppression. Yet doctrinally, our field remains tethered to individual criminal responsibility and to events that are always framed in the microcosm as discrete episodes, sometimes of gross inhumanity, other times of very human-like violence. So colonialism, by contrast, is both systemic, macrocosmic, structural, and often perpetrated through various forms of legality rather than its breakdown, something that has been also, codified in the Apartheid Convention. So the analysis might explore, your analysis might explore more directly whether the form and nature, the very, edifice of international criminal law is capable of capturing a phenomenon that resists individualization and sometimes even identification. So thank you. Without further ado, I pass the floor to our illustrious colleague and a recent father and also a star of international criminal lawyer, Dr. Luigi Daniele.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks, Dimitrios. It's nice to reconnect with some of you and to connect with new colleagues and friends. And thanks also for the overly generous presentation by Dimitrios. Joe, extremely fascinating, thought-provoking, stimulating reflection. I am somehow the worst kind of discussant you could have in front of you, because I have a fairly positivist approach to the study of my discipline, even if with a strong Gramscian background. So, your presentation was speaking a lot to me. So just a couple of questions and a comment, as briefly as I can, because we could be discussing for a long time, and maybe we will after this online discussion. The first question, in the abstract, you were announcing somehow also research on the internal dialectic of the ILC on the meaning of colonialism and how the commissioners reached that definition that you have outlined, which was then removed by the intervention of Western states. Also, another question, so if you can say something more about it, of course you don't have time to detail it in with the degree of specificity, but if there is something in this debate that was somehow striking for you or that you consider particularly revealing of the real power dynamics behind this attempt at codification. The other question, of course, I agree with everything you were saying about, in general, the function often of international criminal justice, in particular of its mythical representation as a sort of progress of civilization. I agree with you, of course. I wonder, and it will be interesting to know what you think about it, if this is not also the outcome of a really excessive projection of expectations, gargantuan expectations on what international criminal justice should have done. I remember discussing with Sheriff Bassiouni, considered the founding father of the institution, and even the narrative of the real life experience of the negotiation was a narrative of somehow an epochal progress with NGO representatives crying happiness and the sensation of having moved a giant step forward for humankind. So it's somehow, this role of obfuscating the atrocity that is inherent in capitalist, racial, and colonial power structure, also the outcome of this excess of expectations. Last point, and here, I'm just offering you my perspective. Of course, all the scholarship of the TWAIL, the several generations of the literature of the third world approaches to international law, and the decolonial scholarship has made us used to the idea of unveiling in international law the dispositives not only not opposing, but even reproducing the power relations of racial, capitalist, and colonial hierarchies. I wonder, however, if this is enough now, because if anything, we have seen in the last few years, in particular around Gaza, the crumbling of the formal alliance between liberal democracies and human rights universalism. So what I'm saying is, even that minimum of justice for mass atrocities that was declared in the previous decades as somehow a not renounceable moral common ground of liberal democracies has completely crumbled at the point that even those very institutions, according to us, obscuring and reproducing those power structures, are now at the center of unprecedented offensives by the very savage powers, somehow reorganizing the world great power balance. So, is there anything else that we have to constrain these savage powers? And maybe is there something that we are missing if we keep trying to identify how those institutions reproduce those power structures, rather than maybe digging in all the technical omissions, the ways in which crimes are construed that make of them a sort of blunt weapon to pursue, even toward the formally declared purposes, accountability, the fight of impunity, the fight against impunity. And one last point, if you think that somehow as a substitution of the lack of an express criminalization of colonialism, I was curious of your thoughts about crimes that capture tools that are essential to every form of colonialism, in particular of settler colonialism. For example, the war crime of transfer by any occupying powers, directly or indirectly, of part of its own civilian population in the territories it occupies. My sensation is that if there wasn't a danger for currently still colonial powers, colonial in the full sense, if there wasn't a danger for them in this crime, we wouldn't have had the attacks against the ICC that we are having, and even before the mobilization among international lawyers to claim that that crime was inapplicable because it required a sort of explicit order by the occupying power toward its own civilian population. So, what is happening? What can we identify? You said yourself that there is a dialogue between this research and the present, and how the omissions that consolidated in the juridical sphere are interacting with the present. So somehow I'm interested in your thoughts about this shift that at least I personally see from the 2 decades of the war on terror to an international power balance that is now claiming the admissibility of annexation and de-Palestinization or de-Ukrainization. So somehow we are back to the international law before contemporaneity. If anything, the post-World War II international order has outlawed annexation. Right. These 4 points. What do you think about these 4 points?
Thank you, Luigi. You promised 2 points and you delivered 4 and 2 questions. I counted. So yeah, that's typical of you, but also really, really interesting points raised. If everyone is in agreement, I will also pass the floor to another stellar multidisciplinary researcher who is well equipped to address this interesting topic. Our second commentator, Anamika, she will also give her feedback. So Anamika, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Demetrius. Thank you, Norman, for inviting me. And thank you, Joe, for your presentation. It was excellent. I really enjoyed thinking along with you because a lot of the themes that you're raising, of course, interface with my own research. So I especially enjoyed the framing of your work as a ghost story of ICL, because I think there are so many stories that are still yet to be told about the discipline itself of international criminal law, but also how we think of what international law is. A lot of my comments and questions will probably focus on the question of location, temporality, and archives that you're using. Mostly because that's also a focus of my own work, but also something where I think the real potential of interdisciplinary research can then come out, especially the way Joe is doing it. So one of the things which really stood out to me was how you were thinking about location in the law, but also how location operates through questions of jurisdiction and jurisprudence itself, and how essentially ICL, through its jurisdictional conversations, also realizes a particular idea of where law happens, how law happens, who are the right subjects of law, who are the right victims of law. And this is very much a conversation that has been quite at the core of how Third World approaches to international law has been trying to intervene in conversations of ICL and ask those questions of that field. But I was wondering how you were thinking also, especially when you were engaging the archive, how you were thinking of your focus on epistemology and how that shifted your engagement with the legal archive. So generally, when legal academics are engaging with the legal archive, there are presumptions of authority, a teleological narrative that is accepted. There's certain rhythms of participants of who makes the knowledge in the archives that are accepted. But when you move to a different focus of epistemology that is trying to not only engage the archive critically, but also engage it, as you said, with a debt to the people who have been violated by that same archive and the material processes that led to the making of the archive. How have you, in your research, perhaps outside of this chapter in your PhD or in other work, have explored kind of sort of unforming that archive and then reforming it to tell the ghost stories? I'd be very interested to hear that. I was also wondering then relatedly, when you talk about settler colonial kinships and how the anti-impunity norm in particular, for example, privileges and therefore then reifies the legitimacy of ICL as a legal discourse, but also as a civilizing discourse and white settler internationalism through that, how that then creates a problematic around the nation state itself as the core building block of international law, in its total kind of sense, but specifically also with ICL, given how much of the operability of international criminal law is dependent on states enforcing it. And so then if we're trying to unthink the violence of ICL, does that then mean we need to unthink the nation state and therefore other sort of nation state-based ideas of justice and recognition in relation to it? Apart from that, what really stood out for me in terms of the research that you're doing around the specific archive of the ILC and the crimes against peace and security, where colonial domination is understood as a crime. And I think this is more in terms of how it also echoes with my own research or resonates with my own research, is how colonial domination is thought of existing through force, but there is no clear articulation of what force is meant over here. The broader understanding of what force generally is understood as within international law, of course, is through the paradigms of armed conflict. But is that only the way to understand force? And I'm wondering if in your own research you came across any other, especially anti-colonial lawyering descriptions or kind of pushes around trying to understand force differently. Of course, like my work is trying to understand force through very much kind of putting it as a constitutive aspect of how international legal subjectivity even comes to be made. Who gets to be human under international law is determined through the use of force, but not use of force just as nation states, but through the paradigm of, for example, slavery. And so I'm wondering if you came across similar sort of examples or like discursively or historically in your research. And I'd just like to hear more about your work.
Thank you, Anamika. So without further ado, we will move to our stellar P commentators as well. Ayesha, I was happy enough to be a commentator for your own presentation. So now I'm more than happy to pass the floor for your brief comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Demetrius. and thank you, Joe, for this presentation. I agree with Anamika, and it brings us to think through our research and all what we are writing. And I'm happy to have this conversation with you because I feel like we are sort of a generation of scholars that we are trying to demonstrate how the recent past was colonialized, even after the independence of a big part of the global south. And I ask myself why we do not manage to, today in the present, create decolonialized institutions. So somehow that we stay in this decolonial critique and we don't manage to create decolonized studies, social science studies in international law. And I wonder if it is because this colonial legacy, it still has an impact in our scholarship, in the international relations, everywhere where we are navigating. And it's like fighting with the past, wanting a different future, and this balance, that this dialogue that you shared, that my colleagues are sharing about a dialogue between the past and the present. And somehow it's frustrating too, because why do we need to keep showing what's obvious? And I ask myself that question. And maybe one of the reasons why we do this is because I agree with Professor Luigi in the way that the Rome Statute, the international criminal institutions were a big progress considering all the history of the past century, and we don't really want to destroy them. But at the same time, we also understand how much this colonial past are shaping the failures of the system today, and why we're struggling so much for crimes that are completely obvious, severe, and punishable to punish them. So I wonder how to make that our research, and in particular your research, is not only a conversation about the past, but also how to start creating for the future and trying to create institutions and decolonize conversations. And then on the topic of criminalization of forcibly maintaining colonialism, international criminal law has this very difficulty of strong evidence base that we need to show that the acts were committed. But what we see today is that these legacies stay in a very subtle way that are influencing all these institutions. And the ICC is one of these very good examples where we see that it is placed in The Hague, that 50% of the staff are Europeans, and that of course it has an influence in the jurisprudence, and then how jurisprudentially they develop the procedures, and etc. and so on. So as much as our in the last century they were thinking about how to punish colonialism, straightforward colonialism, I wonder how we can rethink in the idea of punishing today's legacies of colonialism, and how to use this, try to build justice that adapts to today's world. Thank you so much for this space, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Ayesha. Now, last but not least, Alice will conclude this round of remarks. Alice, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It really means a lot for me, and it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Joe. I learned so much, and it was amazing. And I think this research is absolutely groundbreaking, and I'm sure your PhD is gonna actually make a difference. So thank you for sharing all of this with us. It was a pleasure to listen to you. So this is not exactly my field, so I'm trying to stretch a little bit here and there, and I hope it still makes a little bit of sense. And I'll try to maybe raise 3 points that hopefully will be helpful for the discussion or for your work, your reflection later on. The first is about archives, and I really loved how you explain that you're following the footnotes and looking at the presence in absence, and all of this idea of not only having a linear approach to history, to law, but also like this idea of repairing justice. I think this is absolutely useful from an epistemological and a methodological perspective. And so I wanted to ask two things about this. Is it, did you find any counter archives or any alternative forms of archiving that maybe could help you in this endeavor of bringing together pieces and fragments, and bringing maybe also new voices? And how do these counter archives look like, if they exist in any possible way? And connected to this, how does this methodology work in practice? Because this idea of sewing together, I guess, isn't that straightforward when you actually enter the archive. So I was very curious about your practice as a researcher when entering this field, and maybe wanted to recommend also reading, maybe you're probably familiar with her work, Nora Al-Kadim work on archives, that I found very inspiring from both epistemological and methodological perspective, especially when it comes to counter-archiving and shedding light on forms of resistances within the archives that sometimes just follow below the radar, but doesn't mean that they do not exist. The second point is about hunting. And I was really thinking while listening to you that maybe we could think hunting as having a double face. So we are hunting the ghosts as a method, but the ghosts are also hunting us. So there is this circularity in a way that maybe could be interesting to develop further. And so, of course, these ghosts are hunting us in many different ways, and the attacks against the ICC and international criminal law more broadly are maybe a form of ghosts, coming back, or hunting the people who are still alive in a way. And so maybe this could bring a further layer of reflections about the past being present. And how not only present, but really shaking the foundations of the whole architecture, as you were saying. That I think it's quite something we cannot ignore at the present day when we talk about international criminal law. Otherwise, we risk really closing ourselves up in the ivory tower and being absolutely disconnected with what happens in the world. And lastly, on multidisciplinarity, antidisciplinarity, this is also something I've really struggled with, being in between legal studies and IR, I would say. And I would like to maybe suggest reading the work, if you haven't done already, you probably have, of Thomas Garment Hansen on how we can bring together geopolitical reflections with legal studies. And I think that working with law in context, as you are doing with the archive, is actually one of the most fascinating way out of this dilemma. This doesn't mean that you don't have to do a translation exercise, but I think this, again, it's once again an endeavor of sewing together visions of the world to have more complex one that can bring more clarity and maybe better understanding. So these are my 2 cents, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Alice. Joe, you can begin following but also answering.
Thank you so much. This is phenomenal feedback. This is so helpful, and coming from so many different angles, it's really helped me think. So I think what I'm going to do is go from the last to the first, and I think where they overlap, I'll pick that up. So Alice, thank you. These are such interesting points, and you've given me reading recommendation fashion outside of the legal archive. So yeah, I think novels, I think also looking at sort of reading anti-colonial lawyering alongside other forms of anti-colonial resistance, and thinking of the ways in which people have resisted, to your point, Anamika, about place and space, that if you evacuate geography, which is what happens essentially, you can also take away meaning and allow yourself absolute geography. And I think there's a sort of work that I'm interested in at the moment around jurisdiction and the kind of TWAIL approaches to jurisdiction and how we might think about that in terms of territorial jurisdiction as well there. Let me come to Aisha's point. I thank you, also really, really helpful. I think there's a couple of things here. I think you said, I think it's a luxury to throw away institutions. I think we're in a terrifying, genocidal, all-out moment of global tyranny. So, and I think lawfare is one arm of a way that it can be addressed. I don't think it's the salvation, and I don't think it's a panacea, and I don't think it's the answer, but I think it can be a vehicle. And I think, so I agree with you about not throwing them out. To be honest, I don't see a way that these institutions can be decolonized, because I think they are fundamentally imbricated in colonial domination. They were set up for it. They were the legal epistemology is originating in this. So I don't see that happening, and that doesn't mean that people can't do subversive things within deeply repressive institutions. And I think this comes to, sorry, I've written it down, but I don't remember whose point this was, about reforming the law versus can it be reformed? This is Demetrios, I think. Yes. Okay. So I think this also comes back to the fact that we're a practitioner's discipline in a way, because there must always be a kind of what happens in terms of the ICC, which is important, because I think, as Alice says, you don't want to get distracted from reality. Intellectually, I think that it's unreformable, and I think it's deeply imbricated in settler colonial violence. And at the same time, if it's useful in a particular context, it's fine. And I think that also comes to Luigi's point about other crimes that may encompass the colonial harm, and then the Nakba as a constant process of transfer and displacement, as an ongoing process that also includes fragmentation, where things like, I don't know if this hit all your news, like it hit ours, when a plane of voluntary immigration conned Palestinians arrived in Johannesburg and were basically ethnically cleansed out of Johannesburg, and we've been trying to work on that sort of one of our legal groupings. I think one of my colleagues is in the room, and trying to think about that. And there's just displacement and transfer comes to a limit, because without a kind of undergirding notion of colonialism or some kind of explicit, it can't do, I think, all the things that could be done. But having said this, I don't think criminalization of colonialism could either. I think what's interesting is how the failure to criminalize it produces a certain impunity. And that in turn structures the architecture of international law. Where am I? Luigi, one other point, on the internal stuff. I didn't bring in the internal stuff because, as I said, I was such a positivist about it that it's actually quite boring. It's sort of very, very granular. But let me highlight a couple of moments, and I think, and also to link this to Anamika's point, how do you engage it? One of my concerns is how reliable are you as a narrator, and also who gives you mandate to narrate stories that are not necessarily your own to tell. And I think one can get too caught up in that, but it is something to think about. So what happens is that Doudou Thiam, who's the first foreign minister of independent Senegal, is appointed the special rapporteur. And from what I've read in kind of marginalia, part of what motivated this was that they kind of, it was racist. They sort of thought, we'll give it to the Senegalese guy, and didn't expect him, in the first iteration of the draft to say, of course, we're going to criminalize the most, in stricto sensu, grave crimes against the peace and security of mankind. That's genocide, that's aggression, that's crimes against humanity, that's war crimes, and that's also colonialism, apartheid, ecocide, use of mercenaries, neocolonialism, etc. So I think that's the first point, is that it really was the global South kind of caucused, and it was quite, it's quite a, it's this, I guess, a Hague group moment of state-centric left internationalism, where you had Latin American states, Arab states, African states, Asian states kind of coming together, not states, sorry, representatives, and obviously, and then you have the GDR around, which is also a very interesting dynamic. I think timing-wise, there's two anchor points that I think about quite a lot. The one is 82, Beirut, and this kind of fear that they had that criminalizing colonialism would criminalize Zionism. But there's this other moment, and I think it's around 87, 88, where one of the commissioners says it was Bastille Day, and one of the commissioners, in the meeting records, wishes to convey his congratulations to the French commissioner, how they write in that way, and speaks about the French Revolution being this moment. And interestingly, this French commissioner responds by saying, no, we have to look at Haiti. And so that's kind of bringing in what Trouillot calls the unthinkable crimes, the unthinkable possibility that a Black enslaved nation fought for its own freedom, came up with the first notion of human rights that predated the French Revolution, that's written out of history. So I think that's an interesting moment.
So thank you very much for your presentation. It was insightful, it was also really stimulating, and we have a lot to think about and quite possibly get in touch to discuss. Your work makes a really valuable contribution to the broader discussions on colonialism, the work of the ILC on international criminal law, and has really given much to us and to our audience to reflect on. Obviously, my heartfelt thanks go to our excellent discussants, Luigi, Anamika, and our commentators, Ayesha and Alice, for their thoughtful and engaging feedback, observations, questions, comments, and narrations or narratives, and to everyone who joined us today for participating and supporting the network and this initiative. The GSN warmly welcomes PhD students from all disciplines and from every corner of the world to share their research and receive interdisciplinary feedback. If obviously any of you are interested in presenting your work or taking part in a future session, please contact our host, Dr. Naumanreayat, the founder and convener of the network, at the email address shared in this chat box. Next week, around the same time, we'll be joined by Daniela Facio-Fargas, a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Manchester, who will present their PhD project titled The 2019 Chilean Uprising as an Oasis for Resonance, Collective Vibrations and the Experience of Dissenting Sounds. This will take place on December the 17th, 2025, around the same time. So the seminar of December the 17th will be the last seminar of this phase and this calendar year. The next phase of the GSN weekly online PhD in progress seminar series will commence on January the 14th of the next year, 2026. So till next week, please take care, look after yourselves, and have a glorious day. Goodbye, everyone. And once again, thank you for being here and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.